Hello, and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Ahmed Moor, a non-resident fellow at the Foundation. Today is June 26th, and I'm delighted to be here with Benjamin Balthaser. Benjamin is an associate professor of multi-ethnic U.S. literature at Indiana University, South Bend. His latest book is Citizens of the Whole World, Anti-Zionism and the Cultures of the American Jewish Left. I reached out to Benjamin. So first of all, thank you for being here, Benjamin. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Owen, for hosting me. It's great to be here.
Well, so I reached out to you because of this essay that you wrote in the Boston Review, and it's a book review. It's an essay, and it's more than that. And I recommend it to everybody, and we'll link to it. But it's called "The Outcasts of Zion." Um, the question of Zionism is obviously important to all of us today. What's notable here is that you talk about five books, and you've just written one yourself. I know that Peter Beinart's book, I'll go over the books in a moment, but some of these books, at least one of them, was written in response to the genocide.
Mhm.
Others must have preceded the genocide, given how long it takes to write a proposal and get a book deal, write a book, and some of these are scholarly works, the research that goes into them. And so I'll highlight the books as I said, but my first question to you is why are people contemplating anti-Zionism now? But while you ponder that, I'll just say that the five books are Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza by Peter Beinart, The Threshold of Dissent, A History of American Jewish Critics of Zionism by Marjorie Feld, Doppelganger, which is Naomi Klein's new book, Unsettled, Jews and the Movement for Justice in Palestine by Oren Kroll Zeldin, Our Palestine Question, Israel and American Jewish Descent from 1948 to 78 by Jeffrey Levin. So people have been thinking about this for years, preceded the genocide in most of these cases.
Yeah.
Why are people thinking about these things?
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that you mentioned that many of these books predated the genocide that's happening in Gaza right now and the absolute apocalyptic catastrophe that Israel is unleashing upon the Middle East and upon Palestinians. Because yeah, I think a lot of people had sensed this catastrophe was coming for several years, if not longer. So, one can talk about a number of different ruptures. So there's this kind of, from the perspective of American Jewish Zionists, there is the kind of golden era of the 70s and maybe early 80s, in which there's this kind of Jewish Zionist consensus that really united, you could say, the traditionally progressive Jewish American community with religious conservatives, political conservatives, to a consensus that basically whatever else Jews disagree upon, we are all Zionists now, which hadn't actually been the case in the decades preceding. And this coalition has been breaking up for some time, right? So the first kind of, I would say, fissure in that coalition was famously the invasion of Lebanon in 1982 by Israel. And so you had the first Jewish protests against, specifically, I mean, not the first Jewish protests against Zionism, but the first Jewish organization since the emergence of this consensus to publicly organize as Jews against the actions of Israel. And that was New Jewish Agenda's letter to the New York Times, and also a number of protests they organized in big cities against the invasion with a number of other organizations, right? And since then, there's been that fissure, which sort of the first crack opened in the early 80s, and it's been opening ever since. And I think, people saw a number of things. One is obviously the election of a very right-wing government with Menachem Begin. But then, of course, this right-wing lurch, Begin was only the beginning, right? And so, Netanyahu has been now the longest-serving Israeli prime minister, and really, I think, is a kind of metonym for the direction of the state, right? Which is a very serious right-wing government in coalition with religious conservatives. And then, of course, the failure, absolute catastrophic failure of the peace process, right? So Oslo, in particular, it's obviously very clear Israel was not taking this seriously at all, continued with the settlement expansion, continued with this sort of siege of Gaza, and then, became very clear that the people in control of Israel weren't even happy with, basically 2/3 of the original mandate Palestine, but wanted it all, right? And wanted to relegate Gaza into essentially an open air prison. And so this has become, I think, increasingly apparent. Norm Finkelstein wrote a book in 2014 called This Time They Went Too Far. And I think that's really the moment. And this is the, one of many Israeli bombardments and you could say small incursions into Gaza. And when Finkelstein, who's been a longtime critic of Israel and kind of an iconoclast in multiple different directions at the same time, but he had noticed that sort of major figures, in sort of the Jewish intelligentsia had started to issue criticisms now of Israel in a very public way for the first time. So you had the, I believe it was Goldstone report of the, notable South African Jewish jurist, basically, documenting Israeli war crimes in Gaza. And so this, again, there's been this sort of long, you could say 30-year fissure between a kind of mostly kind of liberal progressive Jewish diaspora that has been marked by a kind of sort of adherence to liberal politics, multiculturalism, liberal democracy, sort of public secular culture, regardless of their own religious observance. And that has been on this kind of, you could say, collision course with the increasingly far-right Israeli governments and their absolute unwillingness to observe Palestinian rights. And so I think, while this has been growing for some time, and a lot of the scholars, I started my own project, gosh, it was probably like 2014, I think, actually around the same time. And it wasn't actually, my observation wasn't, I had been doing anti-Zionist or Palestine solidarity organizing for some time, but had mostly written on the American left and race and empire. But I actually had noticed this kind of new Jewish left that it was emerging. And as someone who'd written about Jewish issues, but was sort of disconnected from my writings about anti-imperialism, had noticed that these things were suddenly converging, right? So I had been writing about this for some time. And yeah, as you mentioned, most of these books in the works for a while. And obviously, just the last comment, the post-October 7th genocide of Gaza has just been this incredible accelerant, right? So that has propelled not only kind of Jewish leftists, but also I think a large swath of kind of Jewish liberal intelligentsia to feel that they have to take a side on this in a way that's actually, I think, relatively new. So,
yeah. And so I'm thinking about the two kind of focal points that you mentioned, the 2009 Operation Cast Lead, and then 2014, the 1,400 Palestinians were killed. I think half of them were children in Gaza. Naomi Klein writes about that in her book as well. And so it sounds like it may be too soon to know, but did the anti-Zionist charge within the American Jewish world accelerate around those two events? I mean, is that the point at which people said, okay, the effort to consolidate Zionist gains in Palestine isn't something I want to be a part of? Or, I'm just again trying to figure out, why are these books being published today?
yeah.
Uh, they again were in the works before the genocide.
Right. Yeah, actually, you're right. It was the Finkelstein book was 2008, not 2004. There's so many Israeli bombardments and invasions of Gaza. I apologize. Sometimes I lose track of which one is which. So yeah, it was in 2008, and I remember very distinctly because I was at UC San Diego as a graduate student, and that actually at that time, the Students for Justice in Palestine was really sort of kicking off around a BDS campaign. So yeah, so it's 2008. Yeah, so I think there's two things, and they have to be entangled a little bit, although they're obviously related. And so one of them, like I said, is this kind of identification with Israel among, again, a kind of Jewish, liberal, progressive, you could say, intelligentsia, civil society, has just become impossible, right? I mean, so it is no longer possible to say I'm a progressive at home and yet I support a fascist government, in Israel. Like the contradictions of that have just become too stark. And of course, the human rights abuses of Israel, in Gaza, and then also their obvious lack of commitment to the two-state solution had just become too much for a certain kind of liberal intelligentsia to bear. But there's other things that are also going on at the same time, right? And so one thing, so yes, there's been a kind of breakaway, you could say, of kind of both liberal and left, and we can distinguish those two tendencies within kind of Jewish American world. Um, uh, and you could talk about various organizations that represent sort of different tendencies, again, in kind of Jewish American world. So one part, I think, again, is this kind of disidentification with Israel, which I think on some level is the product of Israel's success, right? So, for a long time, it was the case that one could be a Jewish leftist in America and just not think about Israel very much at all, right? I mean, this is much of my own family. Yeah, they didn't like Israel, but else they just didn't think about it very much, and there wasn't this sense of being kind of a compulsory Zionist, or Zionism was not a kind of compulsory part of American Jewish life. And so on some level, you could say that Zionists are the victims of their own success. Once being a Zionist is a compulsory part of American Jewish life, then Jews really start paying attention to like what's going on in Israel in a way they didn't used to. And so if Israel is doing things that are kind of running afoul of American liberal Jewish common sense, and I'm not to suggest that American Jewish liberals are some kind of like unicorn. There's all kinds of unpleasant things in American liberal Jewish life. But when I say liberal, I mean in a very broad tent. American Jews still tend to vote Democrat, live in big cities, et cetera. And so are sort of, you could say, part of kind of the fabric of kind of a, multicultural liberalism in a large part. But I think the second part I want to get into, which is, I think, different, aligned with, but also different from the break that starts to happen in 2008 and again in 2014 and again accelerated in 2023, which is this cleavage between the Jewish institutional world of like the ADL and the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, Jewish studies departments, which are increasingly becoming not only compulsorily Zionist, but also increasingly right-wing, right? Actually backing right-wing candidates in the Democratic Party, or actually even Republican candidates, which used to be sort of unheard of in for most American Jews. And so I think that there's been a kind of, a Gramscian sense, this kind of de-alignment or de-attachment with sort of major layers of kind of the Jewish kind of liberal middle classes, you could say, and working classes, with a kind of increasingly reactionary Jewish political elite that you see, again, with like the leaders of the ADL, people like Alan Dershowitz, who are just, I mean, in addition to being Zionists, it's really also just like out of step with like most American Jews. Most American Jews do not look at the genocide in Gaza, particularly middle-class Jews, or look at AIPAC, or look at, Donald Trump for that matter, and say, oh, that's what I want, right? And that identifies with me. I'm not saying, again, that American Jews are necessarily coherent, but there still is a kind of common sense, you could say, particularly kind of middle-class or working-class American Jewish liberalism, has its sort of cultural expressions in, not necessarily the most inspired figures, people like Seth Rogen or Larry David, who are like, again, American liberals. They may not be anti-Zionist, but they look at like the ADL, backing Trump and defending Trump and just being like, I don't want anything to do with that, And so I think there's been so in addition to just the objective characteristics of Israel being increasingly unacceptable to, again, a sort of American Jewish liberal intelligentsia, the institutions, the American Jewish institutions that support Israel have become increasingly de-aligned from, I think you could say, a kind of American Jewish liberal urban cosmopolitan life,
So it sounds like if I could summarize, Peter Beinart wrote about this, and I think it's been rehearsed lots of places, but after 67, the June War, the Six-Day War, American Judaism began to identify more closely with Zionism.
Mhm.
Once one identifies more closely with Zionism, one is forced to pay attention to what Israel is doing. And then there's this juncture between what I believe in the United States as a resident of New York, Philadelphia, or San Diego, and what's happening on the ground in Palestine, Israel. And
Mhm.
then you have dissonance and a potential break, which I think we're seeing accelerate now. So if I could read from your essay, and then we should do definitions here, because I realize we're
Yeah,
using terms that not everybody may agree on.
sure.
So now I'm reading from the essay. This is the introduction. Several recent books chronicling specifically American Jewish dissent from Zionism, past and present, demonstrate how this relatively recent Zionist, quote, consensus was manufactured. Jeffrey Levin
Mhm.
and Marjorie Feld tell stories of once mainstream dissidents and naysayers purged from the ranks of even straightforwardly liberal American Jewish institutions, demonstrating the force with which unconditional support for Israel had to be constructed from the top down in the
Mhm.
immediate post-war era.
Yeah.
Looking to the more recent past, Oren Kroll Zeldin and Peter Beinart examine efforts, in Beinart's case his own, to break through that heavily policed consensus since the turn of the century. And we'll get to Naomi Klein in a moment, but I guess can you describe what these books are doing and why they may be doing it? Why is that important? Who's the readership? Why is it important to say that there's this current of anti-Zionist thought? But I'm getting
Yeah.
ahead of myself. Let's define first Zionism.
Oh yeah. Oh gosh. That's a complicated. I don't know that I could actually define Zionism in a pithy sentence. Obviously, the simplest definition of Zionism is support for a Jewish supremacist state. I mean, there's different definitions of Zionism historically, right? And we could get into kind of
Well,
ancient.
so let me, do
Yeah.
these authors treat Zionism as a single entity, a single idea, a single thing?
Well, I think by definition now you kind of have to, right? So yeah, so you could go back and Levin in particular kind of goes back, a little bit into kind of earlier ideas and some of the early dissent about Zionism in the 40s and 50s not only came from Jewish leftists who were anti-Zionist and also Jewish religious ultra-Orthodox, but also different kinds of Zionists. So, Albert Einstein was a Zionist, or Hannah Arendt was a Zionist. One figure that Levin talks about, Don Peretz, were Zionists, but they were kind of Buberite Zionists. They didn't believe in a Jewish supremacist state. They didn't believe in a single Jewish state. They thought that, Jews having nowhere else to emigrate could go to Mandate Palestine, but had no right to displace other people or create a state that is run for and by Jews only. And of course, these were people, folks like Einstein, Arendt, and Peretz were on the losing side of that fight, right? So some of them, tried as much as they could to work within Jewish institutions like Peretz, and some of them basically became functionally anti-Zionist, like Arendt and Einstein.
And so
So
what were the currents in the 1920s and 30s around anti-Zionism? What is it, an assimilationist perspective?
well, they were interesting. Yeah, that's a great question. So there were different tendencies that were opposed to Zionism in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And so one major current that was opposed to Zionism. So first of all, I should also say Zionism was not terribly influential in the United States up until the 1940s, right? As one New Masses author, Robert Gessner, said, about 1% of American Jews are Zionist. That was probably an overstatement, but it's hyperbole with a certain, more than a grain of truth to it. And the resistance to Zionism came from a couple of different quarters. Probably the most mainstream was sort of, so you could say, like Jewish assimilationism or Jewish Americanism, the idea that Jews want to belong to the countries in which they live. And so, yes, they belong to diasporic communities that often operate as, communities, whatever country they happen to live in, whether that's, South America, North America, Europe, wherever, the Middle East. Um, but they want to belong to the sort of mainstream currents of those countries. And so the fear was that to be a Zionist would to encourage the idea of dual loyalty, right? And actually to engender the very messy, ugly, public, and chaotic split that we're seeing now, where, some Jews are actually posing that Jews should only belong really to Israel. You actually had the American president, liberal American president, Joe Biden, or at least putatively liberal American president Joe Biden, basically saying, nowhere is safe for a Jew if you, don't have Israel protecting you, which, you could hear in a couple of different ways. You could just see Biden as sort of accepting Zionist talking points, but you could also see that as a radical kind of claim to Jewish not belonging, right? And as with the election of Mamdani, there have been these voices saying, no Jews are safe in New York City, which is an insane thing to say. but so I think that was the fear, right? So somehow this would sort of intensify not only claims of Jewish not belonging, but actual realities of Jewish not belonging, right? And so yeah, so with the Reform Jewish tradition, which is probably the most aggressively assimilationist, and then, of course, the American Council on Judaism, which was really the first explicitly Jewish anti-Zionist organization that was not ultra-Orthodox. Um, but you also have the far left, which actually in the 1930s and 40s was very sizable. So, half the Communist Party in America was Jewish at that point. Karen Brodkin, the anthropologist, talks about, hegemonic Jewish socialism, not in the sense that every Jew in America was socialist, but, anti-capitalist, kind of left-wing social democratic ideas were really kind of the majority among the sort of post 1880s immigration wave, which was sort of the largest wave of Jewish immigration. And most Jews, this is the sort of moment in which Jews sort of historically begin to align really not only with the Democratic Party but the New Deal wing, sort of civil rights New Deal wing of American kind of left liberalism. And they really saw, particularly the communists, socialists, Trotskyists, all of which had sort of outsized Jewish membership in the U.S. They really saw Zionism as ethno-fascism, right? And they saw Zionists as kind of the right-wing version of nationalism that basically was sort of the backbone of European fascism, right?
And
And
this is
so
people like Rosa Luxemburg or
yeah, Rosa Luxemburg, or in a more American context, figures like Mike Gold, Robert Gessner, William Zuckerman, Merle Rukeyser. These are kind of sort of well-known figures on the kind of Jewish literary left and organizational left. Emma Goldman being another, who's another well-known Jewish left-wing anti-Zionist. And so, yeah, they really saw the currents of Jewish nationalism as being right-wing, and they really saw through. There's a really great book by Zev Sternhal, which is basically kind of a critical reading of Jewish labor Zionism and socialist Zionism, and they really saw through that immediately that whatever sort of socialist patina was on the kind of surface of kind of early Zionist movements, it always was subservient to Jewish nationalism, clearing of the land, and creating kind of these apartheid settlements. And
so if
so,
I could,
yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
if you allow me to interrupt again, just to synthesize and
I could go on about this. Sorry, I could go on. Please interrupt. Yes, my grandmother
I
says
think it's
not
fantastic that
interrupting.
you can go on.
Yeah, yeah. My grandmother says you're not interrupting, you're not listening. So, anyways, continue. Yes.
I like that. So at Zionism's inception, there
Yeah,
are a few sources of anti-Zionist thought within Europe and then the United States.
yeah,
One is pure assimilationist, the idea that we belong to where we are and we're modern citizens of a modern state, and consequently, we reject the idea that we're going to go off to Palestine.
right.
The second was more rooted in socialism and class critiques
Mhm.
of ethno-nationalism and colonialism.
Yeah,
Um,
I say the big part of it is, of course, the Communist Party, Trotsky's parties were anti-imperialist, right? So they saw Zionism as aligned with the British Empire, right? That was the other part of it.
Even at that stage.
Oh yeah, totally, absolutely, yeah. So and we're very explicit that I mean, the Balfour Declaration kind of gives up the game, So like here you have, this anti-Semitic British imperialist, promising the Jews a homeland, and of course, if any socialist knows anything, you don't ally with British imperialist, colonial lords, So the fact that the British imperialists and ruling class were in favor of a Zionist homeland, for a lot of, if you were wondering what position to take, this made it very clear. I should also say, I mean, some of the left-wing critiques were, would now actually be seen as I mean, just really almost outside the pale. So there was the famous Hebron massacre, Hebron attacks. Um, in the late 1930s, and there was a lot of writing about that at the time. And a huge portion of the kind of Jewish left made this big distinction between Nazi Tsarist, or not Tsarist, but Nazi pogroms against Jews in the 1930s as fascism, but then saw the violence in Hebron as being an anti-colonial struggle. And so, the same debates that are happening now, right, obviously, about how to understand violence against unarmed people, in a colonial setting, were happening back then, and that was a take on the left. So the idea that that this is that this was Zionism was a colonial outpost of the British Empire was certainly an idea in circulation on the left. I mean, of course, this gets complicated in the 1940s. And there's again a debate in the left in the 1940s, particularly as Jews are trying to flee, in late 1930s, 1940s, Jews are trying to flee Europe any way they possibly can, and they're barred from coming to the United States, right? So, Roosevelt, for all of his support among progressive Jews and his relative lack of anti-Semitism for an American president at the time, very much, barred Jewish immigration. In fact, as a young person, my own family, who were, members of, various left-wing organizations, and my extended mom's grandparents, great aunts, etc. One of the many sort of stories I heard growing up, one of them was Roosevelt turning away the Jews, and so that was sort of very much something that people were aware of. And so there was a debate about, well, if Jews have nowhere to go, they should be allowed to go to Palestine, but they just can't create, again, a Jewish supremacist state there. And so, the takes on what Zionism was, how to understand it, had a kind of, kind of a latitude of opinions on the left. But I think, generally speaking, the idea of creating a Jewish ethno-state was very much associated with, like, Jabotinsky, far-right ethno-nationalism. I don't know why I moved British imperialism. So, yeah.
What's striking to me is that there are some parallels here. I mean, there's the Naomi Klein writes pretty eloquently in her book about the contradictory ideas that coexisted within European anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
The socialist Jew who seeks to, reorder society in some nefarious way, and the capitalist Jew who's doing the exact opposite, but also nefarious. And yet, both of those ideas coexisted when you're perpetrating a pogrom or engaging in other anti-Semitic activity. But that framework, the idea of anti-Zionism as a socialist movement, anti-Zionism as being rooted in somebody who feels deeply that they belong into, at that time, a contemporary capitalist European society. That hadn't occurred to me before, but there was also a third, call it current, of anti-Zionism, of course, which related to Orthodox communities. Is that right?
Yeah. So obviously what connects, I'll get to the ultra-Orthodox in a second. And unless I'm not a religious scholar, but I'll do my best. Yeah. But and we can talk a little about Beinart's, I think, reading, which is, again, I think, different from Klein and Kroll-Zeldin in terms of what he's interested in, at least. Not necessarily they disagree in great ways, or they're opposition to one another. But yeah, I mean, the idea of the anti-Semite holds the Jew as both the financier and the Bolshevik simultaneously only makes sense if you see the Jew as kind of a force of modernity, right? Sort of dislocating or displacements of modernity are kind of racialized onto the figure of the sort of cosmopolitan traveling Jew, right? So in some ways,
And
and I
both
think this.
those renditions are cosmopolitan figures.
Exactly, they're cosmopolitan, they're internationalists. And Soros as a single figure, I mean, the sort of genius of anti-Semites today is they found a single figure who represents both, right? So Soros is simultaneously the rich financier and the Bolshevik at the same time, which is brilliant, So, applause, well done, So, but anyways, yeah. So for the ultra-Orthodox, yeah, I mean, this is, I think there's a couple of ways to think about, their kind of resistance to Zionism. Obviously, there's the kind of question of messianism, right? So only the Messiah is supposed to bring about the Jewish return to Palestine and Jerusalem and the temple. I think there's also, I think, probably more informative than the sort of teleological or eschatological versions is just a sort of suspicion of the state itself, right? And this has kind of right-wing and you'd say kind of nominally progressive tendencies within the ultra-Orthodox communities. But, and again, the ultra-Orthodox in New York in particular actually used to be sort of in a coalition with, kind of nominally social democratic candidates because they were, as a way to kind of get social benefits, particularly a lot of the ultra-Orthodox are actually quite impoverished. But, they sort of switched over to Trump in some ways. And I think the anti-statism of the ultra-Orthodox communities can kind of go a lot of ways politically, but I think the anti-Zionism of the ultra-Orthodox, and again, there are many majority ultra-Orthodox in the United States and also in Israel are functionally Zionists, but there is this kind of ultra-Orthodox critique. You see among Satmar and other sort of small, again, kind of sects of the ultra-Orthodox. But I think, again, it's a suspicion of the state, that the state is essentially a secularizing force and is hostile to the religious impulses of, an ecstatic religious community, right? And that they see the state as on some level kind of the enemy. And there's actually a very long Jewish history. And I think what kind of unites kind of the ultra-Orthodox critique to the left-wing critique is a sort of, I think, a kind of gut sense that states are aligned with violence, right? And that this is a very kind of old Jewish diasporic critique of the state. Daniel Boyarin talks about this, sort of noted Jewish studies critic at Berkeley. Walter Benjamin, Judith Butler, sort of talk about the kind of diasporic critique of violence. And violence is basically being kind of the, as Weber famously said, the monopoly of state, states have the monopoly upon violence. And of course, if you're a minority that is diasporic, you by definition don't run the state, right? And so are the receiving end of state violence. And Jews have been on the receiving end of state violence, for most of their history. Obviously, there are ups and downs and moments of prosperity and displacement, but there's kind of general kind of gut suspicion of the state, I think, kind of aligns some of the kind of left-wing critiques and some of the, you could say, ultra-Orthodox religious critiques as well. If, in terms of the theology, Shalom Magid's book, The Necessity of Exile, I think is kind of the most elegant rendering of the idea that, for Jewish religious communities, exile is actually, exile from the original, Hebrew kingdoms of the ancient world, exile into Babylon, whether, half of that is fiction, half of that is myth, and half of that is reality. But, the reality of it is the Torah very much sort of, is born out of this exilic condition, right? And was kind of rewritten and consolidated in this exilic tradition. And so, one could, and Beinart and Magid really make the argument that the sort of Jewish religious traditions of the Torah, of a kind of decentralized, non-clerical religious tradition is born out of this exilic tradition. And so therefore the state is actually kind of an anathema to it, right? And the state is ultimately always already a secularizing force, right?
That's an important, exactly. So that's an important Jewish critique of Zionism, which I think we should talk about. But again, just to frame the conversation, there are distinct currents of anti-Zionist thought at the genesis, starting in the 19th century, go through to the 1960s, 67. Within American Jewish community, the identities grafted onto Zionism, mainly because of the success that Israel sees in June 1967. People begin to pay attention, see what Israel's doing, and find that it may be at odds with their identity as American liberals, which we haven't defined, but I think, I have a reasonably good understanding of, and I hope our listeners do as well. And then these currents are reinvigorated, or what? So, I mean, so Peter Beinart and the other authors have Jewish critiques of Zionism, but Naomi Klein has a distinctly non-Jewish universalist critique. Is that?
Well, so I wouldn't make, so two things. I wouldn't make I think Beinart, in terms of sort of the contemporary kind of liberal critique of Zionism, I think Beinart is kind of a quintessential example, right? So, I don't know Peter personally, but became aware of him in 2012 Well, actually, I was aware of him a little earlier, so he, nominally a liberal, Democratic Party supporter, but, was in favor of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I became more aware of him in 2012. So my academic association, the American Studies Association, took a BDS vote, a boycott, divestment, and sanctions vote, against Israeli apartheid in 2012. And Beinart, wrote a criticism of the vote, but also a defense of the ASA. He kind of it was actually a rather nuanced piece. He said, no, the ASA, they're not anti-Semites. Actually, at the time, we had a Jewish president, Matt Jacobson, um, who's a well-known Jewish studies scholar, American studies scholar. But he said, they're wrong because they see, Israel as part of the, Western colonizing world. And this is this third world liberationist project, which is being misapplied upon. So he had this kind of nuance. I mean, I disagreed with him both about ASA and their reading of it, and also his critique of the BDS vote. But he had this kind of nuanced critique of our vote, which I was, of course, organized in favor of and advocated for. And but so I sort of followed Beinart's trajectory from being, I would say, a kind of Cold War liberal in favor of U.S. imperialism, and again being in favor of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, being a liberal Zionist, to finally now actually calling himself an anti-Zionist, and becoming on the editorial team of Jewish Currents, which is the most highest profile anti-Zionist left-wing Jewish publication at the moment. And so I think, again, he is on some level singular, but also I think exemplary of kind of a trajectory, again, of a certain kind of Jewish intellectual liberal intelligentsia, and also I would say kind of a Jewish progressive common sense. But I wouldn't make a distinction between Naomi Klein as being non-Jewish and Beinart as being Jewish. I think they're just talking about, on some level, different Jewish
Well, to
traditions.
be clear, yeah, fair.
Yeah.
No, I don't want my statement that wasn't my intended characterization.
Oh, fair enough.
Rather,
Yeah.
Peter's book criticizes Zionism from within, from the point of view of somebody who is devoutly Jewish.
Oh, yeah. And also
Uh,
within the Jewish institutional world too, so
yes.
yeah. Yeah.
And so allow me to read from your essay. So um, about Naomi Klein, you write, at stake, she thinks, are not Jewish ethics or Jewish communal institutions so much as the ways that Jewish history and popular Jewish movements in the past can point to a collective future and provide historical footing for those who do not wish, I'm sorry, excuse me, for those who do wish to resist. Seen from this vantage, JVP, which you're a member of, is less a dissenting voice within an increasingly reactionary Jewish institutional world than a part of a new global majority rejecting colonialism, racial apartheid, and militarism. And I think, this harkens back to what we were just talking about in the 1930s and 40s, this internationalism, with everything all the context that that word and all the meaning that that word carries,
Yeah.
which is distinct from saying that, Jewish spirituality and tradition and religious life resists Zionism because it's fundamentally corrupting and idolatrous, which I think is what Peter argued.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, well said. Yeah, and I think that's a big, I wouldn't say a split, because I don't think Beinart and Naomi Klein are in some sense opposed to one another, but they come out of very distinct, I would say, kind of progressive and also Jewish traditions, right? And so, yeah, so Beinart, I think, comes out of, a kind of Jewish institutional, but also religious tradition, that thinks about, as you said, I think quite eloquently, that Israel is both idolatrous, but also, like I said, is engaged in the sort of secular project of state making, which is inherently violent, right? And so it wants to harken back to a kind of diasporic religious notion of what it means to be Jewish, which also has a component of ethics, right? So regard for the neighbor, right? Regard for the other, etc., which is both a kind of secular and religious component to it. So religious in the sense of this is what fulfills essentially this commandment to live, next to the neighbor, but also just a very practical diaspora politics. If you're a small diaspora, you got to live with your neighbors, So, so I think, like, so Beinart's, again, sort of like articulates this kind of tradition from or critique from within a diasporic religious Jewish tradition based on the sort of this portable Torah, right, or exilic Torah. Klein, I think, comes again from a very different tradition, not entirely separate from, right? And I opened the essay with a discussion of Isaac Deutscher, who is a son of a rabbi and also a well-known Trotskyist and Holocaust survivor, and critic of Zionism, who tries to kind of on some level merge, you could say, the kind of Jewish sort of impulse, diasporic Jewish impulse towards internationalism, towards the left, with a kind of history both of being a kind of a persecuted minority, but also the sense of being kind of a portable, a cosmopolitan people who move from place to place, or at least have a community, articulated community around the world that is not bound to a single nation, right? And so, Deutscher makes the argument on some level that if one is a diaspora community, this of course lends itself, not necessarily, but it could lend itself to an identification with an internationalist left, right? And so he says on some level there's a natural fit, you could say, between kind of Jewish diasporic thinking on the one hand and a kind of left internationalism that arises really in the 19th century, 20th century, right? And so yeah, so Klein, so I'll just like so Klein, so it's interesting, I've known of Klein as a Jewish writer, a Jewish journalist for quite some time. She's a little older than me, but we're around the same generation, both Generation X. I became aware of her during the global justice movement, of which I was also a part. And so I identified her as, basically, child, much like myself, the child of progressive left-wing Jewish parents, part of the kind of internationalist left. It's not that she really hid being Jewish, it was certainly something she talked about, but it was not part of her public persona, and sort of, I think, noticed, like myself, around the same time, that there is this new Jewish left-wing movement that is articulating itself, not out of nowhere, but at least in the public eye, for the first time in a couple of decades. And she connects this not to, particularly diasporic religious ideas, but to this Jewish internationalist left that includes Rosa Luxemburg, it includes Emma Goldman, it includes figures like Mike Gold, it includes Leon Trotsky. And, I think it's, again, for a lot of people, there's a certain Jewish tradition of reading people out of Jewish life, right? And Trotsky himself, had a very ambivalent relationship to being Jewish. He rejects it at some parts of his life, embraces it in other parts of his life. Rosa Luxemburg probably even had a more even hostile idea of her Jewishness. Of course, other Jewish leftists like Walter Benjamin very much claim this as a part of their identities. And I
Well,
think,
so again, allow me to interrupt you there because I
yeah,
regret that we're running out of time and I could talk to you
okay.
for hours
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
No, I talked to somebody like you and I gain a reading list, or at least a Google list.
Sorry,
So,
occupational hazard. Yeah.
so today you study American Jewish life, not so much American Jewish life. You study ideas in America and amongst the Jewish community. And so, what is ascendant within anti-Zionist American Jewish life? What are the dominant? What's driving the change to the extent that there is one towards anti-Zionism?
yeah, well, I think for a lot of American Jews, and there's different kind of tendencies, again, within American Jewish life. And one of the things that I talk about in the last chapter of my book, you could say are three different kind of distinct tendencies I don't try to sort of come down in favor of one or the other. I'm just trying to sort of observe, what is the landscape at the moment. And so, of course, you have groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. You also have Democratic Socialists of America, which has a large Jewish presence. And actually, there have been at various moments kind of Jewish caucuses and organizations within DSA, particularly in support of the BDS resolution. And you see this right now, of course, with the Mamdani election. You have large swaths of kind of progressive Jewish voters coming out, for Mamdani, not just as individuals, but as members of organizations. So Jewish Voice for Peace, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, right? Came out very strongly in the magazine Jewish Currents, the Jewish Vote, which is a kind of progressive group aligned with JFREJ, came out very strongly for Mamdani. And so you have, you could say like these kind of like secular, kind of more secular-ish, kind of left-wing currents within Jewish life. And then you also have, again, these kind of more religious currents, and they overlap, but they are also distinct, right? And I think what is motivating it, again, there's two questions, and one we talked about, which is this kind of, again, Zionism being a victim of its own success, that because of this expectation for Jews to identify with Zionism, when we see, Israel committing, war crimes, genocide, human rights abuses, and then also, abandoning whatever pretenses to being a liberal egalitarian state it at least pretended for a while to have, being completely abandoned. Again, there's a kind of, I think, Jewish revulsion. The other part of this, and I think this has been true, there's for American Jewish liberalism, again, which is kind of the main current of American Jewish life, kind of a left liberal sensibility, born out of being a kind of, ethnic and religious minority in a majority Christian nation, right? So, which is a desire to kind of align with the kind of liberal, progressive civil rights forces in the U.S. And so, one of the things that happens in 1967 with the Six-Day War is that Israel was not just embraced by mainstream Jewish life; it was really embraced by sort of mainstream liberal life, right? Israel was seen as a liberal ally that was like America except better. Defeated the ethno-nationalists of Arab states. Was seen as this little spunky can-do nation that was allied to America and had nominal social democrats as its leaders like Golda Meir. And this was always a fiction, a kind of myth on some level, but it was a myth that a lot of Americans bought. And the American, you could say, liberal political classes, to say nothing of the Pentagon, were very invested in, right? And so I think in the moment that it could plausibly said that Israel was kind of a part of the kind of American liberal world writ large, not that's a Jewish liberal world, but the American liberal world. The Democratic Party, was very invested in Israel. Jews, I think, felt like, oh, okay, well, if everyone from Martin Luther King to, Lyndon Johnson is on board with Zionism, then I guess, it's okay for us to be on board with it too, and so actually it was an alignment of like, Jews could be, it was all sort of wings, Jewish liberals, Jewish assimilationists, Jewish conservatives, Jewish war hawks, Jewish ethno-nationalists, all could sort of like, get together in this big kumbaya. And so I think that's the coalition that's fracturing, right? Or is fractured utterly, right? So I think nobody sees Israel as part of a liberal project any longer, so as much as yes, the leadership of the Democratic Party, Chuck Schumer's, Hakeem Jeffries, Richie Torres's, etc., Joe Biden's are very Zionist. If you just look at the polling, right, Israel is not popular among liberal Democrats, right? And so I think for a lot of American Jews, their first definition or their first identification, which is, I think, I mean, it makes sense, right? You do, whether it's an ideological commitment or just a material reality, you belong where you live, right? And so for most American Jews, they think of themselves, yes, i.e., a lot of American Jews are middle class white people, but they also think of themselves as an ethno-religious minority, again, in a dominantly Christian country, right? And it'd be very hard, I think, for most American Jews to vote for the GOP, which, the major component of which is, Christian nationalism, right? And Christian nationalism, and I don't want to essentialize, but Christian nationalism and Jews don't have the greatest history with one another, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, so
Well, I'm glad. I don't think I'd have much of a future in a Christian nationalist country
yeah,
either.
exactly. And so if you want to think about like the Mamdani, Jewish partnership in New York City, there's all this kind of, fevered rhetoric about this Jewish-Muslim divide. And of course that exists. AIPAC is an Islamophobic organization. ADL is an Islamophobic organization. But just on a daily, I think, level of being Americans, I think Jews and Muslims have a lot in common, right? Again, this notion that like we're going to do a lot better if America's a pluralistic, liberal, multicultural, social democratic society that promises freedom for everybody, right? And
Yeah.
that's a progressive idea. And so I think what we're seeing on some level is that yes, there are these different tendencies, and I think there's always been an anti-Zionist Jewish left, and it has been smaller and larger, and you can trace out even new left tendencies, SDS and SWP through Jewish socialist collectives in the 70s and NGA and the formation of Jewish Voice for Peace. There is a through line of this anti-imperialist Jewish left, and Naomi Klein, I think, on some level you could see is the inheritor of that, right? But I think this
Well, that's what's
explosion.
so remarkable. Well, that's what's so remarkable about, obviously the genocide is devastating on every possible level. And you walk around, at least I carry it everywhere I go. At the same time, I feel there's this emerging reinvigoration of American Jewish life. I mean, you mentioned just very briefly that people are identifying as Jewish in ways that they haven't in the past. And it's this almost celebratory identity, and you see it in the DSA, the people who participate in this DSA meetings who are Jewish, and other kind of left internationalist socialist Democrats, democratic socialists.
Yeah.
Um, and so it feels liberatory in a way, right? The ability to just break entirely with Zionism and say, hey, I'm Jewish, I'm liberal, this is my identity, and that thing has nothing to do with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the first thing is that I mean, I want to say too, I mean, I think there is not a Jewish progressive, I mean, not a progressive, I would say, not, anyone with a heart in America that is not just, eviscerated by the genocide in Gaza. I mean, it is every day, the images, the sounds, the suffering, the horror of people being slowly ground into a kind of and seemingly endless night of oppression and death, and it's done with our tax dollars, right? I mean, it's unbearable, and sometimes you can kind of other things take momentarily center stage, the anti-ICE protests or the victory of Mamdani. But I think for most people I know who are progressives in America, this has just been the central fact of being alive, right, for the last 20 months, and it's really unbearable. It is an obscenity kind of flung at the heart of the world. So yeah, so talking about celebration in that context
Well,
seems.
no, I meant it. I meant it really in a positive way. That out of something so dark, you have this ability to kind of rend the prior commitments to say I'm leaving all of that behind.
Yeah, yeah. And
That I'm going to embrace an identity that has nothing to do with this ethno state. At least I see it
absolutely.
amongst, uh,
Yeah. This is actually the point on some level of the book that I wrote, and you can talk about it in a couple of different ways. I mean, one is obviously, um, you know, uh, there are a lot of different sort of ethnic identifications with the history of the left in America, right? And one of the things that I kind of think about is why did this kind of hang on with American Jews longer than it did with, German Americans or Finnish Americans, particularly for white people in America. Not all Jews are white, obviously, but the majority of Jews, are of European, Eastern European descent. And part of it is just simply that Jews, have a historical experience of being a community, kind of wherever they go, right? And it's just kind of this diasporic sensibility, wherever you happen to be, you kind of hang out with other Jews. And it doesn't matter if you're religious or not religious. That's just kind of an expectation, or at least a possibility, and this kind of experience of kind of creating. And this obviously predates Zionism by a long time, thousands of years, right? So there's that. And I think also, though, in an American context, and kind of unlike the European left in particular, the American left has always spoke a kind of ethnic accent, right? At least since the 1920s and 1930s. It has always been, there's never been a purely class-based left, right? It has always kind of spoken through the civil rights movement, through ethnic identifications, through, ethnic voting blocs in the Democratic Party, ethnic city politics. And so I think, for American Jews, that was actually a kind of welcoming place to try to, kind of engage in kind of progressive, ethnic politics. And I think the last part is, again, too, I think there is this just incredible, obviously there's this kind of heartrending despair, right, that is going on with genocide in Gaza. And also just, I mean, the sense of like, not that I was ever really much of a Zionist. I mean, like none of my family really was. I mean, I had a kind of exploration with it as a teenager, but just a sense of like, how awful is it that, the state that represents, you could say, potentially the heights of Jewish culture and learning and whatever, and it's just the most bar violent and chauvinistic state, that one could possibly imagine. There's something very horrible. So I think there's also this, but I think there's this relief on some level that now finally there's a kind of critical mass, whereas, a collectivity, we can say, not just individuals, but a collectivity, we can say, to hell with all of this, we're going to create something entirely new, and also, be a part of, a kind of broader American kind of left-wing social democratic life that is actually, there's a lot of terrible things about America that we could run through them. But one of the nice things about America is the sort of progressive movements in America have, for 100 years, kind of embraced a kind of multiculturalism that other lefts around the world really have a problem with, right? I've always sort of, again, the European left in particular has always had a kind of problem with, kind of thinking about itself as a multicultural movement. In America, because of its sort of, the left's kind of rooting in a kind of civil rights era, sensibility, and kind of the origins, you could say, of even thinking about what it meant to be a progressive, which, is not something that really existed up until the 19th century, and kind of the anti-slavery movements, et cetera. The American left has long had, not perfectly and not ideally, but has long had a kind of language of kind of a mosaic of peoples, coming together for a project. And so there's a kind of wonderful exuberance of saying, yes, we're all coming together, to celebrate who we are in this,
I mean, you see it in the Mamdani victory,
absolutely, yeah,
see that coalition emerge, and it's a principled coalition. And I may be too bold by saying so, but I think it's an anti-Zionist coalition.
absolutely,
Uh,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's
I mean,
encouraging,
yeah,
and
I mean,
it's
some
great to
people,
see.
for whom, oh, sorry, you were saying.
No, please continue. Although
Yeah, some people, oh, please, yeah, no, you.
well, I know I was just saying that it's worth, one thing I've noticed is that the font, the typeset that Mamdani used for his campaign literature resembled, the cover of Jewish Currents.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
don't think that that was a mistake. I think these, his campaign. I think these groups they've worked in concert with one another, and the DSA's in the mix as well. And
Absolutely.
it defines kind of an emergence of a new left in the United States, I'd say.
Absolutely.
And I'm hopeful an anti-Zionist Jewish left as well.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, I think there's different factions of Mondani's coalition, and, some of them are anti-Zionist and some of them are just people for whom Zionism is not the defining characteristic of their politics. But I think at least it's a coalition which anti-Zionism is a welcome part, right? And as an active part. And of course, Mamdani himself, I don't know if, I should, if this is common knowledge or if I should even say it, but, he was one of the founders of the SJP chapter in Bowdoin when he was a student. So, which is
His father's Mahmoud ben Mamdani. So, I
exactly,
mean,
yeah, yeah. So he comes from a proud anti-colonial
yeah.
background. And actually, I was first aware of Mamdani a while ago. He tweeted, oh, I can't remember her name, but the celebratory picture of a young communist who was elected mayor in Kerala in India,
Oh,
uh,
wow.
and was celebrating her as like the voice of the future. And she's this like 21-year-old cadre communist with a red flag in her. So, I've been aware of him as a real leftist for a while. But yeah, so I think he
Well, if
is.
we, forgive me, Benjamin, if we have to wrap up, unfortunately, the call,
Oh,
but
yeah.
if you could just kind of part with 30 seconds, final thoughts on American Jewish anti-Zionism in 2025.
Yeah, I think the beautiful thing about, since we were talking about Mamdani, I think the beautiful part about the Mamdani campaign is it looks very much like the New York City, in some ways, the coalitions in New York City of the 1940s, where you have sizable parts of the, kind of progressive internationalist Jewish community aligning with, other ethnic communities, a labor left, a left, together to create a kind of new social democratic politics, right? And so, whether Mamdani is the future, I really absolutely sincerely hope that he is, but there's certainly a sign that this is a future that large numbers of Americans want right now, right? They want to break, I think, with not only, a right-wing Israeli state, but I think, American imperialism writ large, right? So, I think people are tired of America basically spending more on military than it does on programs of social improvement. And America, being a country that is known for basically, overthrowing governments and stealing people's oil. We're tired of that and we want something
We're
new.
tired of that. I mean, it's a beautiful thought, and it is a bright point in what's otherwise been a pretty bleak
Yes.
uh, 2 years nearly.
It's been a bleak 2 years, and Mamdani is the first thing I'm kind of happy about. So yeah.
100% with you.
Yeah.
Benjamin Balthaser, thank you so much for your time. Thank you
Thank you, Ahmed. Great.
for your thinking, for your scholarship. I can't wait to read your new book, Citizens of the Whole World, Anti-Zionism and the Cultures of the American Jewish Left. And thank you also for the Boston Review essay.
Yeah, thank you, Ahmed. This was great. This was a lovely conversation. Really delightful to be here. So